Hey guys, and welcome back to the Q&A series. Feel free to send your questions, if you have them, to keithballardquestions@gmail.com. Today we are playing Peggle 2, because it's just kind of sitting here in my library. I guess I'm midway through the campaign or something. I guess it doesn't really hurt to just start where I left off, because they're just a bunch of levels that are their own weird little thing. This pseudo-pachinko attempt thing they have. Concerning. Alright, go ahead and just go past that, frankly. Oh my god, I don't remember there being all this dialogue and stuff. I guess they have to explain the powers, though. The Overvolt power charges up the ball. Each peg the ball strikes zaps 2 more pegs. Ooh, it's the chain lightning of peg things. Cool. Alright, well that's over. Alright, so, first question then, from Patrick Reed. Given, it's part 2 of the previous question, basically. Given that there's so many ways to get a PC's output via HDMI now, have you considered making an older PC rig for playing more older games that don't like modern Windows? I will say that no, I have not considered that idea for a number of reasons, really. One, having space for an entire extra computer is just kind of like not really viable. I barely have space as it is because I don't have I'm not living in my own apartment. Like, I have very restricted location in general, so like having all these video game consoles and a PC to record them with / record on in itself is kind of like all I've got. And any more, like, I don't have room for extra desks or more monitors for an extra computer, or I guess I could set up a really complicated multi-monitor thing where you can switch the monitors for different computers or something really complicated about that, but it would be a problem to solve, but I would need a reason to want to solve it, and at the moment I don't think I really have a lot of reason to want to do this kind of thing, because I don't really have a particularly strong interest in classic PC games generally. I don't have a nostalgia for it. Like, I pretty much exclusively played console games such as the Nintendo platforms and stuff like that throughout my childhood. Oh, that was not a great one. Whoops. I pretty much played console games throughout my childhood and didn't really reach anything PC related until I encountered, as mentioned before, Diablo 2 and Age of Empires 2 on PC. Aside from that, I had some really young games I played really early on, like 4th grade adventure and crap like that, or 3rd grade, whatever grade it happened to be. Educational games, basically, is basically what the PC had. That's because that was all it could really run. I think I played Sim Park, and would learn I still recognize bird stock sounds from a lot of games based on Sim Park's use of them. Because video games in general used to be nothing but stock sounds. So I don't have anything that's really causing me, I don't really have classic games that draw me towards the idea of wanting to go through these hurdles in order to enable their usefulness in the process. And part of that is the fact that nowadays, whenever there's an interesting little game that gets a bunch of attention as being like a classic game that everyone wants to play, there's a marketable reason to care about that game all of a sudden, which the result ends up being that people then just go ahead and make a port of it. So like, when there's a big hubbub about BioShock and everyone's like, we should look into this this System Shock 2 game that everyone's talking about. What is that? Like, all this buzz generates about System Shock 2. Lo and behold, before long, they just make a port for System Shock 2. They just, like, companies like GOG will just make new versions of these kinds of games when we're given specific reason to care about them over time. And so, oftentimes, whenever there's some heavily recommended older game, it's actually available to play, and oftentimes I don't have any particular reason to have to go through hurdles for it. Like, I just went ahead and played Morrowind and System Shock 2 and so on, and it just wasn't a big deal. So I've never really encountered a game that I specifically was trying to play, and then was faced by this monumentous roadblock that stops me from being able to play it. It's much more common of a problem for me when I want to play an older console game and I don't want to go through emulation to do so. Partly because like I could even have the console game and own it and the platform it's on, and I'm like, I don't know how to record this, because you have to have specialized hardware to record different things. By far the easiest thing to record is HDMI, which you seem to know because you mentioned it earlier in the context of PCs. Like if I can get an HDMI out on the game, then I'm in great. That was terrible. I'm in great shape. But if I can't get an HDMI out, then I have to deal with other complicated setups and potentially buying new hardware, because I still have a Hauppauge somewhere, I think, that I think still works if I hook it back up, but when around the time I was starting Witcher 3, I switched from my Hauppauge to my Elgato, and I've been using the Elgato ever since, and my Elgato only has a HDMI port and nothing else, which is great, until the moment something causes a problem. More recently I've had a problem with the fact that I wanted to finish Drakengard 3 when I finished Nier, and I was like, let's go do Drakengard 3, and then I realized that that would have been a ridiculously good shot if that just happened. I was gonna go finish Drakengard 3 between Nier and Nier Automata, and then lo and behold, freaking Sony updated their HTCP, so you can't, with my existing HTCP circumventing methods, I can't record PlayStation 3 via HDMI, so I need to get a setup. I either need to get new stuff that can get around the HDCP, or I need to get something that lets me record via the component cables again, and try to figure out a solution around there, which is very frustrating, because I was like, literally have already started stuff on that platform, and can't. And additionally, that's a problem I need to figure out, because I've been talking about the idea of going back to Demon's Souls, and now when I was finally ready to do it, I'm like, oh crap, I can't record PS3 games, though. I need something to fix the fact that I can't record PS3 games before being able to do that. But yeah, to get back on topic, I don't have any PC games drawing me to specifically do this whole thing, and there's not really much demand for it, necessarily. And that's one thing that's worth acknowledging about how this generally goes when people talk about playing older games, is one thing I noticed is that everyone has very unique ideas of what older games I should go back to. It's an element of the, some of it's nostalgia, perhaps, but there's also just elements of, like, that's part of the reason why people play new games as opposed to old a lot, is the fact that there's more focus on them. If a game came out this year, a whole lot of people are interested in thinking about it and would like you to play it. But if you're thinking about a game from 20 years ago, there's like one dude who's thinking about that game, and that guy's gonna be psyched. But a lot of people are not really particularly thinking about that game right now, or particularly in the mood for that game right now. So older games are often worse for growth because people aren't generally looking them up in many cases, but they're not great for your existing audience at times, because oftentimes the people watching aren't necessarily interested in that specific thing. So even when you're choosing an old game, it's probably best to pick a game that has some sort of legacy, or that was a terrible shot, or some sort of ongoing interest. So like that's a good example of that is a game like System Shock 2 or Morrowind. These games that have a legacy of being like back when a franchise wasn't bad yet, or representative of some legacy of influence and stuff like that that has people interested, or just games that were just really popular once upon a time, and as a result people still think about them fondly even after time has passed. Something I've noticed, because I get a lot of comments and a lot of emails and a lot of stuff where people ask me to play very specific games that are old, I find that not only have I often never heard of said games, and they seem to be a specific element of that person's particular nostalgia that's entirely unique to them, like, not only have I never heard of those games, no one else has ever mentioned them before, which is an easy thing to confirm, because I could actually... Nowadays we have search bars built into our email clients, and actually like the YouTube comments thing. I can search my entire dashboard of my entire history of comments I've received on the channel, and search them. And yeah, almost every time someone suggests some game from like the 90s or earlier, and it's not something really brutally obvious, like play A Link to the Past or Super Mario something, it's often a game I've never heard of and no one else has ever mentioned. And then I look up the game, and frankly, 9 out of 10 times it's also a game that usually looks like a game I'm not particularly interested in myself. Because it's like, it's interestingly, it often turns out to be trends of games that also have, like, really negative reviews, I've noticed. People often want me to play, like, obscure JRPGs that got, like, a 60% at the time on average review scores, and I'm like, how is this... Why is that the game you're demanding, I sometimes wonder, and I wonder if it is literally because it was the game they played as a kid, and they maybe even haven't touched it themselves since, or something like that. Or it's just really obscure PC games that, frankly, I could just play in modern contexts, because those kinds of genres often still exist in one way or another, be it some hot indie game that came out recently, or just even oftentimes AAA games that express similar ideas that just don't involve trying to dig back through ancient times. So, there's a lot of variables going on, essentially, which is why we get these meandering answers, because there's so many answers to many of these questions. I don't exclusively not play old games because of views, but also because oftentimes I'm just not really into the idea. People show me a specific older game, and I'm like, I just don't know, in many cases, what the appeal is of that particular game, and I would just rather not, in many cases, let alone worrying about whether or not anyone's going to watch the video, or if I can get it to run, and many other variables. So I think you would essentially probably need to be either watching an older Let's Player, or a Let's Player who just specifically has more PC background, if you want to see somebody who has a specific drive for playing older PC games, because they need to have probably a pre-existing exposure to that particular element of video games in general, just to know what to even want to do in the first place, let alone have like the exposure where, like, they have specific games that they want to go back to, or that they never always meant to get to, because, like, I don't even have examples of, like, old PC games like I always meant to get around to, but just never quite got around to it. Whereas I have hundreds of other examples of, like for me, it's really easy to rail off names of games like Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, or Shadow of the Colossus, or Resident Evil 4, as being, like, a number of older, if not always in part of people's definition of old, but older games that I always meant to get around to but never quite did, and so, like, that kind of stuff makes my list. Like, I want to go around and play the original Resident Evil and see what that's like, or to be frank, probably just the remake that they made. Or I want to play Resident Evil 4 and find out what that's all about, or maybe find out what, like, Dino Crisis and Silent Hill and things like that. Like, I'm curious about all those kinds of things, but it's a whole different subsection. But, like, that's the type of stuff that I was being exposed to, so I have an existing interest in those things, of wanting to get around to them, and that just doesn't exist to me for the type of things that sometimes other people want me to get around to. And I don't know, we can't maintain a simultaneous interest in all things, I suppose. Just like how there's all those people that want me to play obscure PS1 JRPGs that I've never heard of before. I'm like, that'd be a really weird direction to go in, man. And I'm not gonna say that my directions aren't weird, because, like, one of these days I might finally get the hardware together and the software together and, like, do a playthrough of The Bouncer, which I realize is my own weird, like, background thing of, like, odd game that I'm for some reason oddly interested in, but no one else probably is. But that's what happens to that's just what happens, I guess, when you try to look at old stuff, is that everyone has a particular filter of interest and exposure that leads them to specific things, and if you're not in that, then it just doesn't... It's hard to explain what the appeal is, or why you're particularly drawn to that exact idea. But yeah, this is basically a long meandering thing that expresses a bunch of different ideas that all basically amount to just like, I'll play what I feel like playing. Which is not supposed to be a trite, condescending answer. It's just not a... It's just the simplification of all the things I've ultimately said, because that's just that's what a lot of the questions ultimately boil down to. And that's only going to come up more, I'm sure. Now, Corinna asks, which countries would you like to visit sometime? Hard to say. I've always been particularly drawn to things that I've just been exposed to via media, of course, so, like, there's an obvious interest in just wanting to go to England sometime just to see what it's all about, but then, like, studying German makes me want to go to Germany, and of course a number of video games have given me the generic nerd answer of wanting to visit Japan, which would be cool. A number of things keep me away from the ideas of doing stuff like this, which is One, it's kind of expensive to travel, especially if you're not, like, going to European countries when you're in a European country to begin with is not so tough. Which is probably why a lot of people, like Americans, will like do a European tour of sorts and just visit a whole bunch of countries that are all next to each other, because doing them all in one trip is just easier than making trips for each one, and probably cost effective and so on, although you have to have a bunch of time available to yourself. Really, I'm just open to experiences, so if I have free time carved out, and for some reason have the money to travel, then it would be cool to do such a thing. Can I even do this? Oh, that was not the right answer. I was supposed to hit the... like that. I was supposed to do exactly that. Wow, that was lucky. So if I had the time and the means and whatnot to travel, I'm honestly interested in visiting most countries where I feel like I'd be safe. Places that have issues with ongoing violent conflicts or disease outbreaks are obviously red flags, because, well, because of those things. But places that are safe-ish to check out, like, I like new experiences, but at the same time I'm terrified of them. So the two things that stop me, I suppose, from doing those kinds of things are, one, I can be a socially anxious person. I like friends. Like I'm great with hanging out with people that I know and spending time and having long talks and like being very social in those situations at times. But being around even like in a party where like half of the people are people I know and half of the people are people I don't know, it's already harder to deal with. So there are obvious worries to deal with about the idea of going to a completely different country where you're just you're out of your own element on a cultural level and an environmental level. You're literally lost and that you don't know where you are or what to do, and you're surrounded by people you've never met that may or may not even speak the same language as you, which makes the barriers all the more thick at times. And then you additionally have to deal with the idea of like, I guess those were basically the ideas. Actually, I didn't actually have more of a sentence at that point. I just kind of started saying it. But yeah, that stuff worries me about the idea of traveling. I have a lack of experience that is frustrating, which is that I kind of just haven't really traveled much, so I'm bad at it and I don't know what to do. So my family, especially especially during like late 90s, early 2000s, my family was relatively well-to-do. My dad runs an upholstery shop that was doing very, very well at the time, and we were making more than enough money. So I have been on my fair number of trips to, on top of having like basically monthly trips to the Tahoe region, which is close enough, but involves like stays all the time. We'd go to Hawaii, and we would go to Mexico, and we'd go to San Diego, and we'd make trips here and there, but I haven't made it very far. I've been to Texas 2 or 3 times and skipped everything in the middle, apparently, just flew straight there. I've been to Vegas a handful of times, but it's not big travels. Literally just all the places in the United States that are near California, but we could afford to do those kinds of things. So I have been on my fair little bit of trips, but I've never really left the country aside from going to specifically Mexico a couple of times, which is as close as it gets without going to Canada, I guess, as far as like short trips to other countries. And it's always been completely and utterly controlled by a different person. So it's a stress-free thing that I don't have to even figure out. I have never scheduled my own flight or gone to an airport to go for like a flight that I am supposed to go to myself that I set up, and it was for a trip that I'm going on, either that I'm leading or going on alone. I've never even like personally gone to like a subway or long distance train, or even like I don't think I've even used a bus stop outside of like school bus stops, because I live in a spaced out element of California, in the central California area, where everything's spaced out enough, and you kind of have to be self-sufficient to be able to go around for college and stuff like that. Like, I've just driven everywhere my entire life. So, like, I'm garbage at travel. I have no experience with that stuff, so, like, I get nervous about just the idea of, like, how, like, sometimes Birdcatcher and Wander talk about the idea of, like, hey, let's all maybe all go to the same convention sometime. And I'm like, I've never been to a convention, and I've never been to that state, and I've never set up the entire travel system, and I've never tried to book a hotel, and I'm like, oh god, I've technically done all these things on some level, but I have what's probably an entirely unreasonable anxiety tied to the fact that I've never done any of these things ever. And on top of that, I still generally live at what is accepted as being the poverty level in the United States. I do not make any sort of exceptional amount of money, so even though I'm gradually making more money each month or so than I was before, and I am sometimes realizing, oh yeah, I actually can pay for those things that I thought I couldn't pay for. Oh wow, that was terrible. Oh, lucky. Because of my knowledge of being in poverty level and my history of not really ever having a part of my life where I'm used to the idea of making a bunch of money myself, excluding the whole part where my family once had money once upon a time in days before I was ever self-sufficient because I was a child. I constantly have money anxieties, and I'm afraid to spend money on anything, so, like, the idea of traveling to go on a vacation literally does not cross my mind, because I'm like, I could never do that. There's no way. Now, at least. Maybe one day YouTube takes off, or maybe one day I eventually transition to a different career, and maybe something about it eventually is, like, doing great, and then maybe I'll find myself doing those like stereotypical American European tours, or I spend a month in Japan, or visit India, or who the hell knows. I don't completely count it out of my future, but I have not even attempting to plan on the eventuality of those possibilities, both because of my general unease about the idea of being in strange elements with no tether or anything. I definitely have to go with someone, I think. But also because of the money issues of, like, I can't even imagine being in a situation where that's a reasonable way to deal with my monetary situation. So we'll see. What is my favorite book? I don't have a good answer for this. I'm not as well read as people would like to say, generally. I think some people think that I read a ton just because they think I'm smart. That's basically the answer. I generally like the idea of books and would encourage people to read books, but I'm really bad at actually getting around to them myself, and a lot of them are often the literary books that you read for school and things like that. I swear I had an actual answer for this until it just vanished from my head completely. I'm pretty garbage at reading in that I have a really bad tendency to just read genre fiction a lot. So I just read, like, schlocky nonsense novels constantly. That is the worst spot for that green to be in, and I've basically doomed myself at this point. Oh, that's not too... Oh, no, that's not great. Well, I tried. So I've read so many dumb things. Like, as a teenager or a kid or something, I read all of the Halo books, and I read all of the Resident Evil novelizations, which are long, because some author wrote a novelization of every Resident Evil game, but then also wrote an additional novel that took place between every couple of every Resident Evil game. So, like, there'd be a Resident Evil 1 book, then a Resident Evil 1.5 book, basically, and then a Resident Evil 2 book, and so on. It's actually amusing reads because those games are known for having hilariously bad localization and terrible voice acting and a lot of really stupid lines. So amusingly, the Resident Evil book tries to make sense of a lot of those lines by making Barry and Jill and people in the first game in particular not sound like completely insane people, by oftentimes including the line of dialogue that was featured in the game, but then contextualizing it with either more dialogue or a description that makes it sound less completely insane. That's an amusing thing. And the Halo stuff was neat as far as sci-fi concepts go. It's just a really good expansion of the Halo universe that's actually more interesting than any of the story of the actual games themselves. I've read all of John Green's books, which are young adult novels, that almost involve... Pretty sure they basically always involve some socially separated person that has some sort of manic pixie dream girl enter their life and then change their life by disappearing is basically the recurring thing that happens in that stuff. But despite that, like, I did quite enjoy looking for Alaska and so on. I don't think I can accurately say... I don't know if I'd ever say, like, I have a favorite book. I've read, like, Where the Red Fern Grows. I've read, oh god, what was that book? There's some book where, like, all of the adults die on the entire planet, and it's just the kids that are left to live in a post-apocalyptic society, essentially, where it's just everybody, like, less than 18 years old was all of society. In particular, featuring kind of some harrowing sections where, like, some character suffers a bullet wound, and the other kids are trying to figure out, based on documents they find, how to figure out how to, like, do surgery to remove a bullet from somebody with no professionals around to actually help them, like, that kind of stuff. Like, that stuff's neat. The Invisible Man is really good. It's not the H.G. Wells book, which might be good, but I've never read it. But there's a book called The Invisible Man that features... Basically, it's an African-American man that just goes around in a period of society where he realizes that the fact that he's black essentially makes him invisible socially in a number of environments. So he will just blend in because he's essentially faceless, because he's just... People don't see past his race in that story. And it's set in an era where that makes a bit more sense, especially. I'm ashamed to say that I've read a number of the Dan Brown books. At one point, I thought they were great. But over time, I became incredibly aware of the fact that they're basically just highly disposable garbage, because I don't remember any of them. I read everything up to the Da Vinci Code, and then I think I also read The Lost Symbol, or whatever the one he eventually read after Da Vinci Code. So I think I've read 5 Dan Brown books, and I can probably recount for you a number of, like, 3 different scenes total that happened in them. I think that if I were to say favorite, it'd have to be just a series that I really stuck with and went through. I don't think I have a really specific book that really spoke to me on an individual level and, like, changed my life or how I view all of everything. And I am slightly uncomfortable with the idea of saying favorite, because it's easier to say favorite for favorite video games or favorite movies or favorite even albums, because I am much more exposed to those kinds of media than my books. Whereas, like, I'll listen to dozens and dozens of albums and games and books, and I mean a movie is not books. But trying to list a favorite book is almost like trying to list a favorite comic book, in that I shamefully don't have a constant enough exposure to feel happy with my answer. Because basically I'll read like a couple or a handful of books each year total, and then more time will pass, and I'll be forgetting about so many of them as time goes on that I can't remember if there's just a book I remember fondly because it was like something I was exposed to as a child, or what. I'm not super happy with the answer, so I would instead go for, like, just series that I generally enjoyed overall, I suppose. And even then I'm woefully lacking because I haven't read through, like, Lovecraft's background, or I haven't gone through, like, The Wheel of Time is one that people always mention. I've read through Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, and Necroscope. Not all of Necroscope. Necroscope's very fucking long. Really long. But I'm definitely tempted to say any of those. Game of Thrones is interesting because it's like some people even call it like an anti-fantasy novel. Oh, it's essentially a deconstruction of the standard fantasy tropes. It's essentially a mirror image reflection of the concept of Lord of the Rings, with, like, these chosen one characters and destinies and people that are going to save the world because they're heroic and just, and maybe you lose somebody along the way, but maybe not, because frankly one of the main people that dies in freaking Lord of the Rings early on is actually somebody who basically gave into sin. They essentially go into, like, the Adam and Eve archetype, where somebody is tempted by darkness, and then they end up dying in their redemption, and it's like that's like a reoccurring thing for them. So, like, there's a fantasy element to Lord of the Rings that is enjoyable to read, but it is inherently like there's almost like a wish fulfillment, or there's a sense of like, this is how things should be in a just world, and so like things work out for the good people, and things work out because morality matters, which I like morality, but it doesn't necessarily win all the time. So Game of Thrones is kind of refreshing because there are multiple instances, especially early on, where a character will be heroic and do the right thing and be just and open about their intentions and tell everyone everything and try to expose corruption they find, and that doesn't work out for them at all. And then people will like launch crusades to like save the world against this obvious injustice and march across the landscape to fix the big problem that everyone knows needs to be fixed, and that doesn't work out for them at all. And that's just kind of a recurring thing. It's interesting because it feels like Game of Thrones feels like Lord of the Rings meets Fargo, or any Coen Brothers movie situation, which I love the Coen Brothers style of storytelling, which is that they get some characters together. Those characters have a very specific motivation and things that drive them, and you essentially have like the equivalent of like a role play experience where people just play out the experience of how they would behave, and what happens. And what happens isn't like a planned outcome of like, this is what should happen in a good story. It's like, no, this is what's going to happen because this is what would happen if these characters interacted, and that person's going to backstab that person, and that person's going to kill that person, and things are going to play out as they probably should, and even if that pisses everybody off. And so I quite enjoyed going through Game of Thrones. The problem with the books is, of course, that, man, if the writer doesn't have the most incredibly exhaustive way of explaining some things that don't matter, and visual design elements of things that are just like, even when I was going through them on audiobooks, at moments I would just be like zoning out, and I'm like, what are you talking about right now? One thing that seems to stand out to me in particular was the idea that like when was it Catelyn? I forget the names a little bit. When they were going to the Eyrie in the first book, Jesus Christ, his description of this Eyrie, that with the sky door and everything, and the giant climb involved, and like the elevators and little pulley systems you could put people in, and like, or devices in, and like, something about that description was so incredibly long, if I remember correctly, that I was just like, I had to like go back and redo it a few times just to try to absorb what he was saying, because it was so hard to maintain focus on it for some reason. And sometimes he'll just be like, I'm just gonna explain what this meal is set up like for like way too long, because I was hungry when I wrote this part, so I'm gonna just talk about this food for like 5 pages for some reason. So he could use an editor at times, and the fact that honestly, I don't think that people watching it in the shows, people watching the show Game of Thrones, I don't think they're really missing out on a ton, honestly. There's a lot of fluff that's being cut, and a lot of extraneous characters that mostly just make the story really hard to follow, even in book form, even if you're rereading the stuff. So it doesn't hurt that's being... as far as adaptations go, it's not a bad one. It helps as a show. Like Ender's Game clearly suffered from being turned into a movie, even though it was not a particularly long book, but most movies are not long enough to cover the contents of most books, and Ender's Game was one of the cooler books I've gone through, and just watching the movie and feeling nothing was just such a weird experience. The other two things Harry Potter is another one. I think that's kind of self-explanatory. It might be nostalgia, it might just be a personal experience, but I grew up with Harry Potter, in that I literally grew up alongside the character Harry Potter, especially the movie-equipped versions, where I was basically the same age as the character during most of the releases of the movies. So, like, that's a character that was aging as I was aging, and so it was interesting reading one of those books every year, basically, and going through that whole experience. And they're very page-turning, enjoyable fantasy novels, but they also have really well-done story structures from time to time, and good arcs and good characters that are easy to get attached to, and that's all an enjoyable experience. So I like Harry Potter, but I don't think I need to explain Harry Potter very much to anybody, because I think a lot of you probably already know why a lot of people like them, even if you don't, or have some idea of what that is. Necroscope is the weird recommendation, the one you're unlikely to know about. Necroscope is definitely firmly in genre fiction territory. It's interesting because Necroscope is one of the things you'll see me come up to every now and then, which is this idea of playing games or watching movies or so on that are a blend of science fiction and fantasy, or science fiction crossed with like something. It's specifically the idea of mixing supernatural elements of different kinds. So like, I like it in multiple different forms. Like, one is this sci-fi fantasy thing, which is the idea that you have fantasy elements, but then you have exhaustive sci-fi-ish explanations of those fantasy elements, and you clash the two together. It's like the idea of like any sufficiently complicated technology is akin to magic, so then when you have a sci-fi style magic type thing, then suddenly you start having these in-universe explanations as to why the magic stuff is happening and things like that. So I enjoy the sci-fi fantasy thing. I also enjoy like when there's like, say for example, a post-apocalyptic future where specifically technology sometimes survives. So you have your stuff like the Fallout or the 100, where you still keep these high-tech sci-fi elements like AI or machines or something like that, but it's a desert wasteland or something where everybody has to deal with oftentimes beating each other up with swords and armor and stuff, while also having those sci-fi elements floating around. Like, I like that concept, generally. And so the specific element of that is covered by Necroscope is basically taking sci-fi, like, almost oftentimes literally mathematical explanations of how the universe works and crossing them with, like, old school, like, monster movies or monster concepts, like straight up vampires and wolfmen and stuff like that, crossed with like intradimensional travel and stuff like that. And it's a fun premise for a series, because the main character is called a Necroscope because he is a character who can speak to the dead. And the game makes a very specific distinction in the very first book what that means compared to other things, because it's specifically Necroscope versus Necromancer. The villain of the first book is a necromancer. He raises the dead, he defiles the dead, he forces the dead to be his slaves and golems and stuff like that, and do exactly what he wants them to do. Whereas the Necroscope doesn't necessarily have that kind of particular power, and instead he can just speak to the dead. But there's a particular quirk of how this universe works, which is that in this universe, when somebody dies, two things happen, basically. If you're a regular mundane person, your consciousness actually continues to exist, but in the vacuum of nothingness, you kind of fade away, essentially. You kind of you become subdued by oblivion, and it just kind of becomes nothingness. But if you're a great mind, a dedicated mind, and so on, and you may stick around. Let's get the explanation of this person's power real quick, so I can focus. My Nightshade power lets the ball pass through blue pegs. Oh, through them. Interesting. So essentially, what happens in this universe is that if you're a great mind, like say Mobius, a mathematician, you will continue to develop your mathematical theorems and concepts and so on ad nauseum and forever into oblivion and for all time with no distractions. So like this person that was developing math once upon a time will then continue to do so forever. And because they're now immortal and they can now experiment freely with their minds forever, they now have the ability to basically go beyond what anyone could have understood during a single lifetime. And so, like, people who build aqueducts would build more and more complicated aqueducts, and they'd have these blueprints in their heads of these magical, incredible, ridiculous constructs that could serve an entire city so easily, and like all these kinds of concepts. And so what the development here is that he finds the grave of Mobius, and Mobius has now gone on to basically crack how time travel works and how dimensions work. And so when the protagonist encounters a character like this, he can literally gain the power to teleport and travel through time, and even like he gains abilities like the ability to see the very essence of someone's life stream from start to end, and what characters it interacts with, and so on. It gets really weird because the main character of the series becomes completely unrelatable almost within the confines of just the very first book, and ceases to be a relatable character instead this ongoing weird supernatural force, essentially, because he can view the destiny of people, including his own, and he can see like the fact that he will interact, his fate will collide with another person, and that could snuff him out, and he could be dead at that point, and there's probably nothing he can do about those kinds of things. And then he plans other approaches, and you have characters' consciousnesses going from bodies to bodies, and you have I almost said something really ridiculous that spoils the endings of one of the books, but dear lord, some of these books end in the most bizarre ways. But essentially, as he's going through the series, he is getting these more weirder and weirder powers and understandings of the world while simultaneously battling what are usually a series of various vampires. And vampires in this franchise are just the worst concept. They are originally infected by like a leech-like creature seeping under their skin, and it can get you the same way like a tick would get you, where it would just fall out of a tree and then latch onto you when you're not ready, and essentially then spread through your entire body. These sinuous tendrils going through your entire nervous system until it shares your body and then eventually subsumes your entire consciousness, and you become this symbiotic creature that is honestly no longer either of the creatures that originally met when you interacted. And then you gain all these horrible powers of like shape-shifting and mastery over like biological forces on a scale that is most comparable to maybe like the Zerg from StarCraft. Like, it's not just straight up vampires of like they're not just like these pale guys in coats that bite onto sexy women and turn other people into vampires, and you go kill the original one and undo the curse. Like, it's very much not, it doesn't feel like a curse in the Necroscope universe. It feels like a horrible biological monster creature. And they can literally, like, fashion things. Like, they can shape people's bodies. Like, I keep meaning to, and I probably will soon, because I kind of want to play the game at some point. I haven't read I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, but some of the stuff that happens to human beings in the Necroscope series seems comparable to stuff that I've been hinted at may happen in stuff like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which, if you haven't read that book, you may already have some understanding of what it contains based on the part where it's titled I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. Necroscope's kind of a fucked up series. Really weird, nightmarish, horrible things happen. It's not... I'll just say up front, literally every possible trigger warning. If basically anything can upset you in a book, it's very possible it might in this one. And I don't really want to say any of the elements, but yeah. Some people might, if some people looked at those books, they might even be like, ugh. When they go to these Let's Play series, like, this person read those books because of certain things that happened over the course of some of those fucked up books. But I was a teenager, and I was going through them, and at some point I was just thousands of pages into this bizarre thing. This weird horror, sci-fi, fantasy, sometimes probably borderline Lovecraftian nightmare franchise that has like 13 books. I haven't read a single one in probably 8 years or so, so I'm out of touch at this point, and I only ever read probably 6 of them out of 13. If I remember correctly, I read the first 3 books, and then I skipped ahead a bit, and I read the trilogy called the Blood Brother Trilogy, which is essentially something you could jump into on your own if you wanted to. Based on my experience with it, it kind of spoils the other books a bit, like certain specific elements of their outcomes, because they hint at stuff that I didn't see in the other books because I skipped some. But it's an interesting premise, because that the main franchise of the books takes place on Earth in... I don't remember if they're modern time anymore. I don't think they were modern time. I think they were earlier in the 19th century, or earlier in the 20th century, I think. But they took place in, like, recognizable Earth society, so that you could be, so that the normalcy could be made, the disruption of normalcy could be made obvious by all the horrible monsters and stuff like that. But in Blood Brothers, you travel to a completely different world, a world that I'm pretty sure makes no sense on a geologic level, which is that or an astronomical level, but the world has a gargantuan mountain range that goes across what's essentially like the equator, all the way. It's probably not the equator, but it's equator-like line around the planet. There's a gargantuan mountain range, and the mountain range is so tall, and the sun is at the planet rotates at such a specific axis that basically there's one side of the planet that is perpetually day and one side of the planet that's perpetually night. On the far ends of the planet, away from the mountain range, and then around the mountain range itself, there are areas of the planet that are just they have a day-night cycle, but it's so much more truncated. So on Star side of the planet, the sun only comes up every now and then for a relatively short amount of time, and on the sun side of the planet, it's sunny like all the time, but very briefly becomes nighttime. And so this particular sub-area of the franchise is interesting because it basically slides away from the real-world setting that they've established up to that point, and then goes full fantasy with a really weird made-up fantasy world that has crazy rules. And so the fun thing here is that you have, whereas the original books had like a vampire usually you were dealing with, or a few vampires, and that would be the villain of the book, this Blood Brothers series takes place in a world that's ruled by vampires. And we've already established that these are not normal vampires, but fucked up, zergling, nightmare, horrible vampires. So it's way worse than if just like some guy that likes to abduct people sometimes was ruling the planet. What essentially happens is that there are Ares all over one side of the planet. These spires that are each have a different dragon. Almost a dragon. Each have a different vampire lord ruling them, and they have like thralls and weird flesh monsters everywhere, and they just lie in wait, and they experience their decadence and their high life and their immortality and their complete control over their bodies, and then they just lie in wait for the sun to go down briefly on sun side, the side of the planet that all of the humans generally live on. And then you get vampire raids that are just raiding these human settlements and wiping people out and going after them. And so obviously the story itself follows characters that are humans in this world that have to deal with this incredibly, really horrible deck that they've been dealt for how they have to live their entire lives. And so it was a relatively compelling, bonkers storyline that gets just continually weirder, just as much, but despite the fantasy stuff I'm saying, because of the fact that it doesn't feature the protagonist of the main series, it actually is a more grounded story than the rest of the series was, because it doesn't immediately introduce a character in the first book that can travel through dimensions and teleport. Oh, I'm garbage. So I'm one of those people that will totally go on Netflix and add a bunch of stuff to their queue that they totally but like nice, intelligent documentaries they totally intend on watching one day, so they can learn new things about the world, and then watch this schlock all day instead. And that shows in my book history, because it's all genre fiction, it's all fantasy novels and all this other stuff, and it's never like wholesome, interesting stuff that develops metaphors and things like that. But yeah, when I just want to whip out a weird thing to point people at, the one I usually go for is the Necroscope series, because that's the one series that I have a large exposure to that no one seems to have ever heard of, which is weird because it's a very long series, so if somebody was reading these things, because this guy was making a living apparently, those are a thing. Feel free to check them out. I have a lot of them in physical copy with various... They usually have a skull on the cover of various forms, a skull with fangs, or wolf skull or something like that. And yeah, those exist. And that's one potential answer for what my favorite book is, I suppose. And as per usual, I just use this as an excuse to talk about a weird book I know about. Do you plan on making merchandise for the channel? Is the third question that Corinna had after the country and book stuff. Eventually, probably. That's just a reality of monetization of this kind of format and thing. I haven't looked into it too much. I think there's hurdles you have to go through for some of that stuff. You either end up having to package all of it yourself and send it off yourself and having to get all the addresses of all your fans and send them there, or you, like, partner with a particular company that wants to do merchandise, and then you do, like, a limited run. Like, one of the things that comes to mind is George Socks. Super Bunny Hop did a sock deal, which is a weird sentence to say out loud, where he did quote-unquote George socks, which were literally just socks with his face printed on them with the board expression, which was actually really funny. As far as I can tell, it seems like people have to do limited runs because it's not cost-effective to have a constant line of merchandise attached to your channel, because if they're not actively selling, then you can't really actively make them reasonably. You kind of have to, like... It seems like people do pre-orders or something. They'll be like, hey, here's this thing, it'll be for limited run, buy it now, and then everyone buys it, and then the limited run ends, and then, based on the number of orders, the number of merchandise items is then created to satisfy the exact demand, one-to-one, and then it's over or something. But yeah, I basically know almost nothing about merchandising and have not gone into it so much, partly because, I've got like two issues, which is one, I don't know... I'm not super sure what I would put on merchandising, because I'm not like a catchphrase person that has like a bunch of catchphrases and like in-jokes necessarily that are easily printed on stuff. I'm also probably overly self-conscious about graphic tees and the quotes therein, and wonder like why. Like I look at shirts I've seen on Game Grumps and other brands, and I'm like, why would somebody wear that sentence on their shirt? It'll make no sense to anyone, and it's not like a joke, but like it's just a reference to something no one will understand. And I'm like, so I'm often like, I'm probably more critical of merchandise than the consumers that buy them often are, so I probably overthink the idea of whether or not anyone would want them in the first place. But also just need to figure out things like, how interested would people be in merchandise? If I were to go for something, how many people would actually buy them? Is my audience large enough to actually even make that kind of idea viable in the first place? Because I don't have a gargantuan audience. If I upload a video in general, like, usually a few hundred people watch it. And so you think about, like, monetization, like, for example, if I think about, like, how many people watch a video, subscribe to my channel versus how many people support my Patreon, for example, that's kind of a metric that gives you, like, maybe some idea of, like, compared to the number of people who watch a video advertising a particular piece of merch, how many people would actually want to buy it in total, and is that then translatable into a cost-profit ratio that actually is a gain that makes it worth doing in the first place? It's a nightmare. The likely outcome is that, because I do know a fair number of larger YouTubers and stuff like that, it's entirely possible at some point I'll just talk to one of them that has done this kind of thing and figure out how they did it and learn from what they did, or even like if, like I can picture Wanderbot in particular. Wanderbot has like 3 or 4 times my subscriber count at this point, and he and his fiance? I always want to say wife, but I think they're just... Are they even engaged? I forget too often, and it's a problem for because I should know these things. But Wander and Shell are both artists, and they can make very high-quality stuff themselves, and so like they're much more likely to get on the bandwagon of merchandising first, because they can literally create their own merchandise from the ground up, and then ship the graphics off to be printed or whatever. So when they probably inevitably have some kind of thing, I'd probably talk to them about what to do. But, yeah, I'm kind of clueless. One of the only things that comes to mind is maybe I could talk to Wander about whether or not whether or not we can work out some kind of deal regarding if I printed merchandise featuring like that high-resolution image I use as my channel's banner. I say talk to him because he's the one that made it in the first place, and so I need to figure out what the hell... I think there's a legal thing to figure out there, right? When somebody else made something for you, I don't think you can just, like, commission an artist and then use it for merchandising that wasn't originally part of the commission. That's probably something you have to work out as a deal afterwards. So basically the answer on the merchandise topic is a whole lot of I don't know, but it's not a thoughtless I don't know, where I just shrug it off and ignore. It's something that I don't know, but also I've thought about it, and how much I don't know. One of my favorite things about myself, just in general, is that I almost make a point of knowing just enough about stuff to know how much I don't know about stuff. And I like that about myself only because I've encountered a lot of people that are way too secure in what they know, and that those people frustrate the hell out of me. Like, I have family members that will just make a claim, and they will just stick to that thing. And they will be so certain, and they won't even, like, entertain the idea that you might raise counterpoints that completely contradict the thing they're saying, because they said a thing and they believe in themselves, so obviously I guess they must just be right, which is how a lot of people work. Instead, I constantly doubt everything I say all the time and everything I think, and every time I learn about anything, because I think about it a lot, I usually, in the process of learning about the thing, have raised 17 more questions that I don't know in the process of answering just one question, and so then I'm right back at square one of not having any idea. Which is not, it's not as paralyzing as it sounds. Because obviously I do things and survive as a human being. But yeah, I make a point to be always hopefully asking all the questions instead of assuming answers to things. And I think that works out for me. Maybe. I don't even know where I'm going with that. It's just a side tangent, because I was just talking about how much I don't know things, and I think a lot of the questions, a lot of the answers I give to the questions in the series, I guess, are almost like very long-winded 15-minute explanations that amount to a shrug. And I'm very aware of that. But also, I like that I'm that person, and I'm not particularly bothered by that, even if I do at sometimes wonder if I'm even making even vaguely watchable content by basically spending 20 minutes not answering a question. Okay, well, that took an exceptionally long time, and I prepared a lot of questions to answer today, and did not get to them. So those are still in my text document, and I'll get to those in the next video. I am not missing questions. I've thrown out a couple of questions because they seem to be duplicate questions of somebody that someone else just asked, or even a variation of a question the same person asked earlier or something like that. But generally, I'm mostly answering all questions in a vaguely chronological order in which they're asked, so feel free to keep sending in questions. If I run out of backlog, the series may just die, but for the moment we have a fair number of backlog for a few weeks. But don't let the delay discourage you, because if you think of a question now, you should send it now, because you might not think of it later when it actually would be time to answer it. So, and the questions are not falling through the cracks or disappearing, because I have them in a backlog, chronological, and so on. Thanks for watching, like always, listening to me ramble about, I don't know, I guess I could play the video back to figure out what I said. Send your questions to keithballardquestions@gmail.com. This is the Q&A series that's uploaded on, unless I screw up, Fridays at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time, noon-ish in California, basically. Thanks for watching, like always, guys. Thanks for putting up with my bullshit, and I'll see you next time.